Chapter 5 The Ocean Voyage. It was early in the morning as the officers of the Kitsune Navy would escort Natalia and companions to the ship that would take them across the ocean into the Void Kingdom. It was a new ship, and one of the best and most expensive in the Kitsune Navy. Built with the firepower of a light cruiser in a destroyer-sized package, and virtually undetectable by radar, thermal, and sound. The Kitsune Navy called it the KCSS Tempest, with the original purpose being a mobile siege engine to be used in a potential war with the Tanuki clan. After all, the Kitsune top brass had strategized what tactics would be most effective to win a war against the Tanukis. And seeing how many natural barriers that protected the Tanukis, they understood a land invasion starting the war would be impossible. So instead they proposed a fleet of stealth ships that would navigate in unpredictable patterns to disable Tanuki coastal defenses, protecting potential places to set up a beachhead for invasion, while also having the effective range to hit targets deep within the Tanuki Republic behind its mountain barriers with the Tempest's railguns. Targets would be key infrastructure in logistics hubs, and depending on whether or not Tanukis surrender, was a possibility would determine whether or not civilian settlements would be targeted. However, ever since the Tanukis cooperated with the Americans to create the TCI Interceptor as a low-budget but near equally effective alternative to the F-182 Night Stalker, the Tempest-class stealth ships finally had a real weakness. And since then, the Kitsune Navy ceased production on new Tempest-class stealth destroyers and instead repurposed them for force projection, and where surprise attacks were critical. And in this mission of getting into the Void Kingdom undetected, the KCSS Tempest stealth capabilities were critical. And with one look, Natalia got an idea of what the Kitsune clan spent most of their military budget on, as the army was just given bare-bones equipment, and almost entirely conscripts. She also got an eerie feeling knowing that the KCSS Tempest was originally created for. And as she stepped offshore and onto the ship with Father Victor seeing her and her companion set sail, Natalia looked back with sadness, wondering if this would be the last time she saw him and her family. Finnegan then saw the expression on Natalia's face and started to half-heartedly sing, "I thought I heard the old man say, 'Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Tomorrow ye will get your pay, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. For the voyage is long and the winds don't blow, and it's time for us to leave her.'" But the first officer of the ship overheard Finnegan sing this and said, "You'll stop that singing that shanty right now if you know what happens to those who sing it at the beginning of a voyage." "Then what should I sing if you like me to sing for the moment where my friend has to leave her family behind, not knowing if she'll ever see them again? How about something that won't invite misfortune while we're out at sea?" "Fine then. Oh, we'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. We'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. We'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. And we'll all hang on behind. And we'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along. And we'll all hang on behind." And to this the first officer was satisfied and returned to his post as Finnegan continued to half-heartedly sing "A Drop of Nelson's Blood," as Natalia prayed for peace on her voyage to the Void Kingdom. Natalia also knew that she would be spending 2 weeks in a cramped bunk, with things being mostly uneventful and routine and monotonous. But at least the Kitsune Navy cared enough about their sailors to make their bunks adequate for maintaining good spinal health and proper restorative sleep, to fulfill their duties during their routine schedule. It was also evident that by the rations the Kitsune Navy didn't cheap out, even if there were no desserts among them, but carefully portioned for maximum nutritional quality, while also tasting reasonable quality. But at the same time, You couldn't expect rations to be reserved for years to be as good as home cooking anyway. After all, how were things at home anyway? Did Jeremiah and Edenthiel have their first child? How were her three little brothers doing back home? And how were they doing with their lives there? Sure, Natalia was with her fiance, being the love of her life, but it wasn't like she stopped loving her family because she and her fiance loved each other. So, Natalia asked Buck, "Do you ever miss your family when we're away like this?" Buck thought for a moment before answering while seeing Natalia looking to need someone to comfort her. "I do miss them and care about them, but my mother less so, and definitely not my father. He can rot in that cell where he belongs for all I care." "I feel like I agree with you. One thing about being the eldest child of my family was that my little brothers always looked up to me, maybe even more so than my own mother. I've always felt the need to protect them and care for them. It's just being this way for so long means I can't be for them when they need me." Buck sat down next to Natalia and stayed silent until he perceived Natalia was willing to listen. "If it makes you feel any better, at least they have someone good to look up to, and hopefully, by your example, serve to their benefit. And you've definitely had a much better father to raise them than I did for my siblings, and I basically had to raise my siblings myself after fleeing my old country. I was just fortunate enough to raise them when they were older rather than trying to raise an infant with no help. And having good people in our lives like Father Victor, his little sister Zenko, definitely helps a lot. How she's basically the reason my little brother and sister turned out as well as they did when I couldn't be there for them." Natalia sighed. "I'm going to miss Zenko too while on this mission. I wonder if my dad has figured out that she's a kitsune yet and not this classy young woman she presents herself to be. Even still, it's funny how someone as good-natured as her is terrified of my dad's lazy and fat basset hound who doesn't have a mean bone in his body. Well, she is a fox after all, and I don't think foxes and hounds make great friends, unless you're Father Victor. He loves beagles. As for Philomena, honestly, she really shouldn't have come along with us, but I didn't want to make her feel like her coming all this way was pointless. But at least if any of us get hurt, we have our own healer better than any medicine could be. Besides, at least Finnegan has someone to talk to, so he doesn't have to feel like a third wheel with us who's only here because Inari ordered him to pay off a debt. Plus, it's a lot less suspicious with Philly and Finnegan knowing Philly isn't a furry. Even though Finnegan has a fursona and recently bought one of our fellow agents a bad dragon product as a joke retirement gift. Even if that was pretty funny. I think buying fantasy-themed sex toy might be pushing it a bit too far. Given that Philomena and Finnegan were just passengers on the KCSS Tempest, the captain of the ship didn't mind the two sharing a room together. But while in their room on opposite bunks, Philomena asked, "You ever been to the Void Kingdom before?" Finnegan looked into Philomena's pretty face and answered, "No, you?" "I have, actually." "Can you tell me anything about it?" Philomena readjusted herself before letting out a sigh. "It's not a place I particularly liked. There's a lot of poverty there, and it's not the kind from bad circumstances. King Azrael is a monster in how he rules his kingdom. And Natalia did to Tanya a public service, so she didn't have to go back there. But look at her now. She's forced to go back there anyway for nothing that was her own fault. It's almost hard to believe a good girl like that was born to such a terrible father." "I guess Titania and Buck have that in common. But does she have any siblings so she doesn't have to become a queen if she doesn't want to?" "She has two from different concubines. Titania was his favorite because she was born from his actual wife until Titania disobeyed him in search of the truth and got exiled. And it was during her exile that I met Natalia, and I just couldn't trust her because my heart sense couldn't read through her Tanuki heart mask. And not having heart sense for an Amorian girl like me is like navigating life blind, where you don't have to constantly think and feel your way around instead of just seeing it. But her sisters may actually be just as bad as King Azrael, with the only one having some chance at being good being her older poison dragonborn sister Rhea. She isn't a great person, but she's not a monster either, and more like true neutral, whereas I tend to think of Inari as lawful neutral bordering on lawful good. Finnegan let out. Lawful good? You have to be joking, right? I'm being serious. I don't think desiring good things like prosperity for your own people is evil. And I know you've had bad things happen between you two. And yes, my heart sense can tell she's a snob and a bit too much attached to public opinion and luxury. But the fact that she's willing to fight that impulse that is so common to a lot of women, so she can raise her child well, says a lot about her. Well, we all have our own problems, and my heart sense can tell yours is lust. Not towards me, but other vixens. And when Finnegan heard Philomena mention his lust problem, he blushed and looked very embarrassed. Philomena continued, You're fortunate only Amoyans like me have heart sense, and you keep your lust under control when around other people. It's usually when you're by yourself where it becomes most apparent, and I can't entirely fault you with how much porn is everywhere on the internet, where it seems to find you more than you look for it. And being the young Todd you are, it doesn't take much to inflame lust. But I'll stop embarrassing you now. Thank you, but to my defense, I've been trying to find a wife for decades, even just another kitsune to just be friends with that isn't another Todd. And when you have a whole bunch of sexual energy and don't have a healthy outlet like physical exercise or a wife, it just builds up and lust overtakes you when I'm by myself. And what really makes this embarrassing is the fact that I'm talking about my secret problem with a pretty girl in a private room here. I figured as much. And I know I had a lot of admirers when I was in school because I was known as one of the pretty girls. But there is something that has to be said about looks. They matter, but only for the first few months, and when you start noticing what someone's actually like, and looks start to play a much less significant role. They did for me, and just because I have heart sense doesn't mean I'm immune to infatuation, and a few times got into a few relationships I ended up leaving because the guy was hot but turned out to be a total douchebag. And I think that's what separates love from lust. Lust just looks at a hot body and wants to indulge itself, only to discard it when the pleasure fades, unlike love, which actually cares about the person. And I care about you. And I hope the vixen you end up with someday cares about you too, and doesn't treat you as a means to an end. You have a heart, Finnegan, so you just need to embrace it and accept it as a part of yourself, and not give it to people who will just abuse it and hurt you. That's just the thing, isn't it? I don't have heart sense like you, so I just have to have reasonable faith that someone is trustworthy. And there's always a chance that I could be wrong. But at the same time, I can't just walk through life paranoid about everything. So whether I like it or not, I'm always forced to take some risk, even if that risk is quite low. Tell me, did you ever get a chance to talk to old Zoomers and Gen Alpha people and what their lives were like growing up in America? I've had the chance to talk to a few, and I get the feeling this is going to be about trust. It is, and like those Zoomers and Gen Alpha kids who grew up in the time when it was hard to trust people. We were lied to and betrayed by the people we were supposed to trust the most. With all the silent censorship and propaganda, it became nearly impossible to know the truth about what was really going on. And they were all isolated and unable to form communities and meaningful relationships because of that betrayal and lack of trust in each other, which allowed tyranny to take hold across America until the tyrants died off. Then the churches basically rebuilt America as the only institution that survived the collapse of the old American Republic. I knew when I first arrived in the 2010s, not unlike what Father Victor and Metropolitan Onesimus are doing with the youth of the Kitsune Society. But during that time, when the old America collapsed and became ruled by that dictator's supreme leader, Maximilian Williams, it was hell on earth and a reign of terror, not even enough trust between people to organize and fight for their own rights. And when you've lived through something like that, it sticks with you for a long time, and you'd probably never forget about it. And in the back of the mind, you'll always be questioning whether you can trust anyone. I just hope that never happens in the fake kingdom or in our lifetimes. But with heart sense, it's really easy to determine whether or not someone is trustworthy or dishonest, because I can almost directly see what's really in their hearts and the core of their being. The only beings that come close are those nine-tailed kitsunes that have ethereal magic and limited clairvoyance, which still doesn't come quite as close as heart sense. That's honestly terrifying to think about. Someone can have total knowledge of you, yet you can only know partial knowledge of them. If someone with heart sense has malicious intentions and is a good actor, it would be almost impossible for other people to know the truth until inconsistencies are found, which may not be found in time. I guess that's why we're trained along with regular law enforcement and military that should an Amorian be corrupted into using dark magic, that we are ordered to shoot to kill and burn the body. And your kind's inherent ability to use heart sense is what makes your kind, when you use dark magic, especially dangerous, because you can fine-tune it to use against people to a much higher effectiveness, whereas someone like the dark mage can at best make educated guesses. There's also the fact that the Morians have the highest potential for magical potential energy, when trained with few other magical creatures coming close like true Ninetails, and very potent Dragonborn with their dragon transformation. But given that you're not a user of dark magic, you don't have to worry about that or Natalia turning on you and becoming your enemy unless you really do something to deserve that. And you being blind to our Tanuki heart mask, I doubt you will. Geez, you're quite dramatic, like me having heart sense makes me a potential supervillain. Not entirely, but I do know what the Dark Mage had more than one acolyte by the name of Gumiho, just being one of multiple. Other ones we know exist include, but are not limited to, the Nightmare Monsters, who were not originally objects brought to false life through magic, but were originally people like Cerberus and the Shadow Dragon. Cerberus was originally a group of Inus who began to follow after Isis after betraying their own pack, and through dark magic lost themselves and became the nightmare monster Cerberus, who was a slave to Isis. And the Shadow Dragon was a dark magic user who learned under Isis and was originally a dragonborn, tortured and corrupted through suffering and consumed with unending hatred, pride, and envy. He too is a slave to the Dark Mage, entirely controlled through his pain and suffering. There are others too that we only know about by name and their species and little else. One of which your heart sense would be perfect at sniffing out, being a corrupted Tanuki girl, referred to by her pseudonym Deluzio. After Natalia and her companions set sail, Father Victor met with his longtime friend for many centuries, Todd Reddington, in his tavern just to spend some time together. And in that tavern was also Todd's wife Vixie and her assistant Dixie and Inari, who wasn't having any alcohol during her pregnancy. And Dixie really wanted to irritate Inari because of her snobbery, but she refrained from doing so for the health of Inari's baby. After all, it had been known for a long time that bodily health wasn't the sole factor in fetal development, and that emotional health also played a role. Todd then said to Inari, "This is the first time in a long time you ever came to my establishment. What brings you here when you have all that luxury in your place?" Inari answered, "I came to you because I have questions about the Reddington village where I intend to raise my child. You have connections, and I have the right to know whether or not it is a good place to raise a child outside the palace walls." Todd thinks for a moment about the kinds of questions Inari might ask with her husband Sozin around. It's probably better than most places in your kingdom. Definitely better than the metropolises. There's a reason I left Inari City a century ago. And that reason was how bad things got with corruption and taxes well beyond reasonable means. Unlike you, I don't have a super high profit off my own enterprise. So if you want to raise your child like everyone else, you'll want to find some place that's affordable and reasonably safe. The Reddington Village has that. And it's a good thing we didn't let investment firms buy out all the vacant properties, do literally nothing to them, and sell them for extortionate prices. In just my personal opinion, I don't think corporations should be allowed to buy housing, because everywhere it's happened in this country, it just ends up being a monopoly and takes things unaffordable for the masses just looking for a place to live. And I only bring that up because as Empress you have the authority to change that. I'll take that into consideration, because monopolies are generally terrible for the economy, just like when the biggest energy company in my kingdom tried to suppress and stop the development of fusion power. And that monopoly alone set our energy production back 40 years compared to Silsida and the United States, who had working fusion power since the 2050s, when all we had to do was just copy their designs that best suited our needs. But I don't think I can really expect much better from people who put short-term profits with stagnation above long-term loss. Short-term loss, with long-term compound economic gain. And as you've hopefully seen in your own life, after fusion power was put into place, electricity prices dropped to almost free. And fuel prices went down because we didn't need a ridiculous amount of coal and natural gas to power these oversized power plants, and instead use them for other things. And knowing that we're in an economic depression, the last thing we need is basic goods and services like shelter and food to be unaffordable, thanks to monopolies only looking out for their short-term bottom line, at the expense of everything else. And if they're complaining no one wants to work when their paying is starvation wages, while being valued as trillion-dollar company, you deserve to go out of business. And even I, who's quite avaricious and a snob, can manage to find it within myself to pay my servants living wages and give them a decent condition. After all, as tradition in my own kingdom, I am expected to provide for my servants as both empress and lady over them. And with my reputation as image of prosperity, I'd also like to extend that prosperity to my citizens if I'm able. Now I have to ask the question. There's no doubt you're a very recognizable person in our kingdom, so everyone in the Reddington Village is going to recognize you. How are you going to raise your child there without people potentially treating it like a prince or envying your child because of its relation to you as its mother? Kids can be quite mean to kids who aren't like everyone else. I guess I'll just have to teach my child how to stand up for itself. And there's really nothing I can do about people knowing who I am. After all, it's hard not to notice someone like me when my face is everywhere. I will also personally make sure my child is properly disciplined with the help of my husband, who is definitely a much better person than me. And there's also something I want you to know, since you volunteered to be the godfather of my child. I am expecting you to basically be my child's uncle. If that makes any sense, as I don't have much extended family, with it just being my brother and Zenko. You and your wife are like that extended family my child is going to need. And should I and my husband die before my child is old enough, I want your wife to run the kingdom and help raise my child in my place until then. And I trust you and your wife will fulfill that duty to me and my kingdom. Todd perked both his ears up and tilted his head in curiosity. You would really want me to raise your child if something happened to you? Don't you personally hate me and have hated me for the longest time? I don't hate you. I just find you really irritating, like Dixie. But you have all the characteristics of a good father, as I can see in how you and your wife raised your children. So, my own experience of your family and traditions of my kingdom, you are a great father, just like my husband. But hopefully it never has to come to that point where I die before my child is old enough to rule the kingdom. I wouldn't want my child to be an orphan either and leave my wife alone to raise our child. My family is honored that you would entrust us with the future of our kingdom. It's just a shame I'm only able to have one and need all these medical procedures to have a child in my old age. I've always been attracted to my husband, even centuries before we got married, but never did because I preoccupied myself too much with running the kingdom with my mother taught me. Only now do I realize she was wrong and a terrible person, even by the reasoning of our customs. And with the last century of my life, I want to be the mother and wife my mother never was to me, or my brother and Zenko, and my father. I still remember my father and how he was a better parent and someone who actually cared about me, but was pretty much powerless in the relationship because my mother was empress. And he wasn't even nobility. And sure, he was a pagan priest and one of the biggest Inari shrines in my kingdom. But at least he was consistent and cared about the prosperity of those who would come after him, rather than use the most common religion in our kingdom for his own personal gain. He was a pious man, even if pious to someone who didn't deserve it. And unlike my mother, he didn't disown my brother for becoming a monk and passing his right to the throne to me. And for my father not disowning my brother, he met a horrible fate and left to be a vagabond that I took care of when my mother experienced death by holiness for her sheer unwavering impurity. But because of his tortures he endured, I could not keep him for long when I became the empress, and he died at the young age of 5 centuries, with only being a 5-tails. And when I had freed him from his torturers, his last words were to me, "Are my son and daughter safe?" And when I had told him the truth, he died peacefully while I was present with my brother who was there with me. He's someone who's been a very good influence on my life, even if I'm not a pagan anymore. Father Victor was listening to Inari and Todd's conversation and interjected. I concur that my father was someone who has also been a good influence on my life and my sister. So even though he died outside the church and was a pagan, I can still acknowledge the good things he instilled in me, like his concern about the well-being of those people who would come after him. He was someone who planted trees knowing whose shade he would never sit. He ended up paying a heavy price for true piety, even if it was piety towards an idol. And in his pursuit of honorable living, sincerity, and purity, he instilled that into me, which eventually started my own journey as a monk, taking those virtues to their true ends. And even though I know the cult of Inari doesn't really have many formal dogmas or scriptures or creeds, when I was still a pagan so many centuries ago, preparing to become the image of Inari, I tended to see my mother as something of a heretic, because of her oppressive rule being anti-prosperity by nature, because of how unstable oppression becomes over time. I had learned as much from my royal scholars in our studies of antiquities and histories of Kitsune and Neko civilizations, and some stolen Solsaran texts from Tanuki bandits and pirates. And if Natalia, Buck, and Finnegan don't bring an end to King Azrael's reign, his tyranny will most likely rip itself apart when he no longer has the strength to impose his own will. Dixie spoke up. Right. So I hope those American Tanukis and Finnegan put an end to King Azrael and the Dark Mage and make a peaceful transition to power. But if that doesn't happen, I'll need to prepare for the worst that is to come. And not wanting Dixie to have the last word, Inari said, and that's why I'm putting my most effective executor, your boss, in charge of running the kingdom while I'm going through having a child. She's resourceful and proven herself time and time again, and has kept this depression from becoming cataclysmic. Did you know this? Sea shanty superstition. There's a real-world superstition that if you sing the sea shanty "Leave her, Johnny, leave her" on the beginning of an ocean voyage, that you are inviting a misfortune while out at sea. The Tempest-class stealth destroyer. This ship was based on a real-world ship in the United States Navy called the Zumwalt-class destroyer. It was designed as a stealth ship, and almost everything on it is automated, and created for the purpose of a first strike missions and surprise attacks and offensive missions. However, the Zumwalt-class destroyer was not put into full-scale production because of its sheer price tag and not being much stealthier than a fishing boat, even if its radar cross-section was much less than a destroyer of similar size, which light up on a radar like a Christmas tree. However, in the timeline of AWFT, many of the problems the Zumwalt-class destroyer had were fixed. And because the Kitsune clan is mostly made up of islands, it made sense for them to spend most of their military budget on the Navy and Air Force.